This is CNN.
On Larry King Live.
The topic we address today is as old as the human beings on this planet. What world are we living in? What is the world? Who made it, if anyone did it at all? And why are we living? Central questions for everyone, but answers are rare, if existing at all. Answers have been tried by many, and the two probably most controversial approaches, the one with a religious background and the modern scientific one, are here today to be discussed. Religion versus science. The religious point of view is represented by someone who knows the answers of religion better than anyone else on the globe today, His Eminence Cardinal Umberto Corleone, a member of the Holy Community at the Vatican and a daily speaking partner of the Pope, several popes so far, if I may say so. On the other side, we welcome one of the most renowned physicists on the planet today, nominated several times for the Nobel Prize, and teacher and researcher at one of the most advanced universities in our modern world, Professor Erwin Hochstein. You said modern scientific. I can only underline that this trend to describe the world with so-called scientific methods is just a few hundred years old. Religious answers are thousands of years old.
Maybe, but it is quality that counts. 1,000 years of ignorance can just be ignored by people with a minimum of common sense.
Well, before we go into details and start to fight each other from the beginning, let's try to find some points where both worlds agree.
Forget it.
The world started at some time. You, Professor Hochstein, call it the Big Bang, and religion also talks about a beginning. But what was there before this start of the world?
There was nothing. No matter, no space, not even a vacuum. Just nothing. But I'm sure that the representative of the Church will claim that God was there.
On the contrary, we think that there was nothing, in fact. So much nothing that not even the nothing was there.
Great! We have already agreed on a very important point. And then it started. How?
We cannot know the reasons for this start. That is beyond our human understanding. We only know that from one moment to the other, and we talk here about attoseconds, the world started to exist.
When you say no, what do you mean by that? Do you have some documents or witnesses from that time?
Well, let me be more precise. We have a theory, the Big Bang theory, that describes the start of the universe.
We believe that we know more about that start. Out of nothing, God created himself, and together with himself the whole world. From nothing to everything. And there it was, the universe.
But sorry, but that is complete nonsense.
Now, gentlemen, before we get lost in those discussions, why don't we agree on a common framework for evaluating the different theories?
Good idea. We have a scientific approach with which we can prove or disprove any wild idea. We must not invent any other method.
Excellent. The scientific approach is exactly what we apply to our belief as well.
Oh my God!
Eminence, could you describe your approach and see whether Professor Horstein could agree? Of course, the standard pattern in this scientific process looks like the following. First, you observe a phenomenon. Second, you hypothesize about the most likely cause for the observation. Third, you make a qualitative or quantitative model that could possibly describe the observation. Fourth, you make predictions according to the proposed models. Fifth, you check if the predictions of the model are correct by making real experiments in nature. Finally, if the predictions of the model fit with nature, then the model can be assumed to be correct until further notice. If the predictions of the model do not fit with nature, then the model is simply wrong.
Well, that is roughly the scientific approach, but not a religious one.
How do you come to such a conclusion? It is the only reasonable one, and by that exactly the religious one.
Larry, that is complete nonsense. I think we should finalize this discussion now. I have other things to do.
Professor Horstein, I understand your reluctance, but shouldn't we test somehow whether the approach of the religion is in fact the same as the scientific way? If yes, we would have found another agreement.
Forget it.
Eminence, using this scientific approach, why don't you explain to us how the world developed after the start? With pleasure. After God had created himself out of nothing, the greatest creation ever, he wanted to give his creation, the universe, as we like to call it, some rules and structures. He created more gods. We could call them sub-gods in our modern understanding. In the beginning there were 3 sub-gods named Pos, Nek and Graph. Later on, more sub-gods were created by God. And what did those sub-gods do? Graph was responsible for all matter in the universe. Graph had strict rules how to behave in connection with matter. Pos and Nek had different tasks. When, for example, Pos came close to Nek, they united to simple matter and joined Graph. When you observe, for example, that two parts of matter repel each other, you can be sure that they both are occupied by either neck or pos. With more experiments, you can even find the rules that had been given by God and predict how the sub-gods will behave.
But sorry, but that is complete nonsense. I assume you want to introduce electrons and protons, and then you introduce sub-gods.
We do not introduce sub-gods. They are there, also without our observation.
But these are simply electrons and protons.
Can you tell me what an electron is?
Of course, an electron behaves under certain conditions in a very specific way that can be precisely predicted.
Fine, but what is an electron?
Yeah. We don't know what an electron is, but we know exactly how it behaves.
Fine, that we also know, but we know even more. We know what your electron, how you prefer to call it, is in fact the sub-god neck. You can apply the scientific standard process as we agreed upon a minute ago and come to exactly the same result with your interpretation as with our description.
But why should we introduce something like God or sub-gods instead of an electron, if an electron is enough to describe the phenomena?
Because it is not enough.
Gentlemen, give me a minute to understand what has been said so far. You, Eminence, have a description of the world that is in line with a scientific approach, and you, Professor Horstein, have a similar description. Does that mean that the conflict between religion and science has been solved?
If we reduce our description to a pure semantic basis, electron or sub-god neck, we could possibly agree on a common approach. Even so, I do not see the need for this obscure religious interpretation. But what about the first moments after the Big Bang? We know...
You mean you have a theory?
We have a theory that the universe went to a short phase of inflation for a few million years before the present rules were stabilizing. We have a number of observations to support that theory, but to be humble, the last proof has not been made.
And will probably never be made.
Well, what is your scientific theory about the very early phase of the universe? I'm really curious.
As we all understand immediately, the creation of a whole universe is an immense task even for God. God needed to experiment a little bit before he was satisfied with his great creation. The next step in his work was the inauguration of a new sub-god called Tim. the origin, by the way, for the English word time. God gave strict rules to Tim, and he thought about restricting the speed with which Tim could move on the territory belonging to another subgod, Spes. But in the beginning, God allowed Tim to overspeed significantly, and only after a few million years, how you, Professor, like to describe the time, he limited the speed to a value which we nowadays called c, the speed of light. In this early phase of the universe, it could, with the permission of God, expand with an enormous speed, the effect that you call inflation.
For heaven's sake, can you prove that with a scientific procedure?
In the same way as you can prove your theory, isn't it?
Gentlemen, it seems more and more that the views previously considered as controversial are in fact very similar.
Wait a minute. That is all so unscientific.
But can't both views be tested and approved by the scientific procedure we defined in the beginning of our discussion?
I think so, yes.
Well, maybe the description holds in simple cases, but what about the theory of relativity of Albert Einstein? Do you also for that come with a stupid explanation?
You may call it stupid, but what Einstein found out was known long before to the human beings.
What?
Let me explain it, that you, with your rather limited view, may understand it. After God had distributed the enormous work of running a universe, he had to check whether his orders were strictly followed by the subgods. So he traveled with his subgod Tim at almost the speed of light through the universe. So for God, time was passing extremely slowly. When it took a day for him, and I take the length of a day as we experience it now, the rest of the universe had already aged by around 2 billion years. 7 days for God are 14 billion years of the universe. We can read in the Bible, written by very wise people thousands of years before Albert Einstein, that God created the world in 7 days. Absolutely correct. For the universe itself, that meant 14 billion years. By this extremely fast movement, God could inspect the whole universe and take corrections if something was not done according to his orders, which always can happen, of course.
Such a bullshit. pure speculation out of the blue. Can you prove that?
We use the same procedure for the proof as you do with your speculations of the world after the Big Bang.
Gentlemen, let me wrap up our discussion. Both sides use the same scientific approach, and both can prove their theories within that framework. I do not really see any contradictions here.
But which of these theories are the more appropriate ones? Look at the fantastic progress civilization has made in the last centuries. All the technical innovations, machines, trains, airplanes, power plants, iPhones, you name it. Do you really think that a fairy tale with sun-gods could have done all this?
What you refer to is the technical application of the knowledge behind the theories. We both understand how nature is working, but your theory cannot explain why nature is as it is. The how is the same in both our descriptions of the world. But the why, the deepest cause of everything existing, comes from religion, and only from religion. I feel sorry for you that you are only interested in the practical aspects, that you want to build tools for the people and nothing else. All your so-called basic research can only, at best, find another how, but never a why. You should be honest enough to admit that.
Thank you, Eminence and Professor, for this open discussion. I hope that we all got a bit wiser. See you next Sunday on Larry King Live at CNN.
On Larry King Live.